Hello, and thank you for joining us for today's webcast on preparing for a crisis. This program is part of SHRM's webcast series. You can see a list of available and upcoming events at shrm.org/webcast, and you can get program announcements from SHRM's newsletters, including HR Daily and HR Week. SHRM would like to thank today's program sponsor, iJet, for helping make today's webcast available to the HR community. And now about today's program. Your organization can no longer just react to crises, whether they happen in the office or are encountered by employees as they travel locally or even domestically. Today's program will provide you with ideas on how you can prepare for, monitor, and if needed, respond to crises to protect your most valuable assets, your people. SHRM is pleased to welcome Bruce McIndoe to lead today's program. Bruce McIndoe is a recognized leader in risk management, travel, and intelligence industries. As founder and CEO of iJet International, he's been the key contributor to the company's strategic growth, securing its position as a leader in business resiliency with the development of the WorldQ Global Control Center. Prior to joining iJet, Mr. McIndoe was founder and CEO of CSSI. He is also on the adjunct faculty of the University of Maryland University College, where he teaches security and intelligence-related courses. With introductions complete, I'm pleased now to turn over the webcast microphone to today's presenter, Mr. Bruce McIndoe.
Thank you, and thank everyone for taking some time out today to spend some time on a topic that we have a lot of a passion about, and obviously it's a topic for the times. I'm going to spend pretty quickly to talk a little bit about kind of the global and business imperatives driving the need for looking at people risk management, whether it's local nationals or local staff within your office in a given city, or if it's international operations or supply, whatever it may be. There's a lot going on that can impact your business, and we'll talk about that, and just as a reminder. And then what I like to do in the basics is, if you only have a little bit of time or you only have a little bit of energy and resources to attack this issue, this is like 4 slides that says, here's the basics. If you don't do anything else, if you just do these things, you're going to be one big step further. We're going to talk about the importance of communications around managing, proactively avoiding problems, but also dealing with incidents. And then I'm going to go at the end and actually talk in more detail. What does a more fulsome program look like in a mature state? So you can kind of think about what the end point would be for a program and how you can benchmark and measure that program. So that's what we're going to try to accomplish here in the next 45 minutes. And with that, going into this global and business imperative is to think about, as we all know, just year over year, and the data supports this, the frequency and severity of incidents that are occurring have been increasing year over year. The frequency meaning the number of incidents that are impacting global companies. That's twofold. Yes, there are more incidents, but global companies have been expanding their footprint, so they have more exposure globally, where a decade ago your company may not have been active in Asia, but they are now, or Africa, or wherever. And so incidents that were occurring historically just weren't relevant, but now they are. And so this is a reminder of that activity and a lot of the things out there that were kind of major level events that had a lot of impact to our clients. When we think about our client base, we have about 700 of the global 2,000, so the 2,000 largest companies in the world. We've helped about 300 of those companies put together and sustain a global, what we call integrated risk management program, of which people are one of the key elements of that program. And so what I'm going to walk through here today is a lot of experience that we've had about helping companies implement these kinds of programs. Whenever we talk to HR people, which we are today, there's another very important element when you think about threat, and that is health threat, because there's nothing that can really disturb and disrupt operations in a business than having an infectious disease run through your workforce and end up being in a degraded state. And so, we deal with this every year, and it's Southern Hemisphere, Northern Hemisphere flu outbreaks and those kinds of things. And there's always a constant eye toward other infectious disease making its way into the workforce that would either cause people to not be able to work and do the things that you need them to do, or diseases that occur within the community that would necessitate a lot of your employees to be home with sick kids and potentially older parents, which also prevents them from coming to work. So it may be impacting them directly or indirectly, but at the end of the day, you don't have the workforce that you need to get your work done. So health threats and health mitigation is a very important piece of HR's role for a lot of companies. Even if they have their own health, safety, and environment team, they're very focused on making sure that the workforce is there and supported. When we look at what we do relative to sending out alerts, so we do 24/7 monitoring, providing functional managers like yourselves in HR, business continuity, supply chain, security, keeping them apprised of what's out there that might be potentially impacting their operations, or have like an earthquake or something. And you can see that a lot of our mission is focused on security issues, so social unrest and shootings, bombings, whatever it may be. About 4% of our alerting is around health, and so these are the important pieces that you want to look at, whether it's mumps or TB or variants of flu, those kinds of things. But it's also interesting that environment, so weather and environment issues are also big issues that occur out there as well. So just trying to give you an idea of the kinds of things that can disrupt your business and your workforce. I put this next slide in here because when you're trying to communicate to management around putting these kinds of programs in place, they want to understand not just necessarily disruption, but what's the cost potentially of doing this or not doing this, and there's a lot of good data out there. And if you dig into this, of course, we're happy if you just want to send us a note. We can provide things. But different countries have different regulations and different laws. As you can see in here, in the UK, the Corporate Manslaughter Act. We operate within kind of OSHA and just general tort law around employee safety and employee health and those kinds of things. Australia and other countries have their own local work laws, and so you can kind of combine all that together depending on your footprint to say, what is the legal exposure of your company not providing proactive support for your people operating locally or internationally, and pull together a business case. But I just thought it'd be interesting to have some of these at your fingertips. So if I'm just kind of summarizing the business imperative piece of this is, we're talking about, protecting your people, whether they're operating there locally, domestically, or whether they're running around the globe on your behalf is kind of the core objective here. There's a legal obligation to warn or inform your employees of known hazards or safety issues. This is the same for your workplace around equipment and tools that they would use for their job, as it is for them to operate and travel and do those kinds of things. So if you know there's a potential harm, it's your responsibility to inform that employee to be able to make a decision whether they want to proceed and do whatever you're asking them to do in the face of that potential harm, or as an employer, you have to mitigate and provide safety equipment or training or whatever to help mitigate the potential of that harm. And if you don't, then that comes under negligence, and that you knew the harm, you did nothing to avoid it or protect the employee, and they're injured, then that's treble damages. On the risk mitigation then is that whole effort of doing things to help your employees not be harmed in whatever they're doing. And it's the same as the workplace, where you're training your employees to properly use equipment and tools and driver training and whatever it is that your company is involved with. It extends to those employees that are operating outside of the company. And this is especially around travel, or if they're on a foreign assignment, to provide them appropriate training for their health and safety. Important piece of this for your business is to have some number that employee can call, and it needs to be 24/7. We're all essentially global businesses, and even though the company may not be global, having people traveling globally, by definition, they need help locally in their local time, which can be usually 2 o'clock in the morning on Sunday. And so having an assistance capability where they can get help is important. And we like to say one number, because when you inundate employees with 3 or 4 or 5 numbers to call, one for health, and one for transportation, and one for the company to call back home, and it gets very confusing for employees versus just dialing quote unquote the corporate 911. And then of course with all of this, you need to have in place typically through third parties, either through your insurer with an assistance or in a direct assistance contract, is who's actually going to respond and help fix the problem, either providing guidance and advice or actually evacuating your employee from the situation, whether it's a medical, security, or other evacuation. So this is really all of the elements you need to tick the boxes on when you think about your people risk management program. So what we want to do is we're going to use the polling feature of this tool to try to get some feedback from all of you. And so we're going to ask first question here is really thinking about these business imperatives and what's going on in the world, and ask, okay, in the last 6 months, has this impacted you at all? And so we're going to ask you, that you're actually more engaged because of the events over the last 6 months, or really nothing's changed, or we've actually stepped down our level of engagement around these issues. And this will give us some idea of where you as a group are seeing this going. So, and this is sort of what I would have expected given what's going on here. So about 30% roughly of the group of this particular poll has said we have had to step up our game because of what's been occurring globally this year. Otherwise, we're pretty much keeping things balanced and doing what we've been doing. So that's interesting. But again, this energy that we've seen and the level of engagement, having been at this for about 15 years, it was interesting that we've had a lot of issues in 15 years, but in the last few years with Paris 1 and 2 and Nice, Turkey, and in Istanbul, the Brussels attack was a major inflection of point with our client base, and we've seen more engagement around this issue since Brussels than really in the last 15 years. It was just an amazing uptick. And I would attribute that to a couple of things. One is Brussels is a popular city for our clients to have personnel. So it's no longer just over there in Yemen or Indonesia or whatever that's impacting my travelers. It was now locally in Europe, in a place where I do have locally assigned people, employees. And because of the nature of the attack, it was the airport, so that was a traveler problem, but not so much my local team. But when it was the subway and impacted the transportation network, well, that's any employee that could have been commuting to and from work. So it really put on the table in a very stark way that the problem is now in our front yard, not over there across, over in the neighbor's house. And this now is an issue for all personnel to be supported and understand what's going on and be provided advice about what to do about it when these kinds of incidents occur. So that's, I think, a good perspective on these things. So when we think about the imperatives and kind of what's driving companies to have to step up their game in keeping an eye on their people and supporting them, the next few slides here is what I call the basics. And this is kind of classic, systems processes around PDCA, which is plan, do, check, act. And so anybody that's in the business process game, Six Sigma and those kinds of things, this is a very typical model. And we look at this, and the four things that you need to do, that just if you're going to sit here today and say, what am I going to do about protecting my people, is develop and document a plan. What is your plan? What is your plan if you have foreknowledge? How are you going to communicate that out to your personnel so that they can act on it and hopefully avoid the problem in the first place? If you aren't forewarned and you have an incident, whether it's a natural disaster like a hurricane or an earthquake, or if it's an active shooter, or if it's a terrorist bomb like in Brussels, what are you going to do? What do you want your employees to do? What are you going to do? And just get some of those basic things down, and that's our plan. You have to educate people on the plan, and there's two cohorts. One is your employees, so that they know what to do and what to expect in either of those cases, foreknowledge or incident. But you also have to educate your internal team that's actually going to be managing the incident, right? So you've got to do the team, which would be typically called an incident or emergency management team, your crisis management team, so that they're prepared to actually manage it, and then of course your people on what it is that you want them to do and what they should expect from the company when something like this happens. Then check the practice, right? You've got to actually run some exercises and do some drills and make sure that it works and that people actually see and feel how this all works and can feel confident that when it's live and real that it'll work for them. And then when you go through this process, you're going to find lessons learned, and you go back and you update your plan and your procedures so that you can enhance and optimize and make sure that this basic system that you've put in place right here in one slide is going to do the basics for you and do the right thing for your people. And so that's what I call the basics. When we talk about that then for your people and say, okay, how do we kind of back off and say, well, what are those proactive things that we can do to help our people and personnel, whether they're employees, contractors, interviewees that happen to be in the buildings? We need to understand first, what is the threat environment so we can measure and understand where do we want to expend our resources, because we can't treat the whole world as a high-risk, high-threat environment when it's not. It'd be way too expensive. We need to make sure and drill into our personnel, who should they turn to for help? It's just like when you're growing up in kindergarten in the United States, 911. If anything's happening and you need help, call 911, right? And the company needs to have the same kind of a program when they're onboarding employees throughout the year. Maybe they have a safety day, getting people to put this into their cell phone, whatever it may be, but a constant reminder that says, call this number if you ever need any help relative to safety and security while you're employed with our company is really the best starting point. And then, of course, any education that you can do, and later we'll talk about the 10 key process areas, so kind of 10 implementation modules of a mature program. And as we go through and benchmark companies around this program, and we've done over about 153 companies that we've benchmarked with this tool, the number one KPI that is the weakest in every program that we evaluate is education and training. It's the least invested area when we do the initial benchmarking, and we've proven over and over again that it's the highest ROI for your spend in helping to protect your people. And it shouldn't be really that difficult to get your head around, because you can think about it in your own personal life. If you're faced with an issue and you have tools in your toolkit to help you hopefully avoid that issue at that moment, then we don't need anything else in the system. You've now avoided that problem. You know, like it's walking up to your car in the grocery store parking lot in the early evening, and you peek into the back seat and nobody's there. If somebody was there, you run. You just avoided a big, big problem. But if you didn't really think about it and that wasn't part of your ethos, and you open the car and all of a sudden somebody pops up and says, "You're going with me, thank you very much," then now we have a problem and everything has to kick into action. So by training your personnel on just basic safety and security awareness, and for them to understand at that moment enough knowledge to make a good decision about not getting into that, cab that's out in front of the airport in Bogota at 2 in the morning because your plane was late, just because they happened to be there, but actually to secure a driver from the hotel or a reputable company to come get you, or Uber or whoever it might be, then that's a safer approach than just jumping into a vehicle at 2 a.m. in certain countries, right? So it's all about that, and can really make a difference to the whole program. And this last bullet I think is important because it feeds off of the whole education. If the only education that you can muster resources for is to just focus on the personal security training, because then again, if you can have your workforce have basic capabilities to manage their own safety and security, then you're going to be a lot better off than investing money in a lot of other things. So that's, kind of our guidance about, if you only have limited time, limited resources, I'm trying to get down to the very basics for you to be able to make some progress. When we do the personal security training, we use what we call the FACE format. So how to teach people to be more aware of their surroundings, so focus, how they hold themselves and their actions, and how to maintain, quote unquote, a low profile, both in their action as well as their appearance, and then how to leverage the environment for their safety, both being aware of potential environmental hazards that can impact them, but also use the environment for cover and to be able to elude or escape. And so that's just giving you a high level, what does it mean? What does personal security training mean? And that's where we would go. So with that, I'm going to go to the next piece of this. The most critical element of a risk management program for your people is communication. If you can't communicate with them, then your ability to help them is almost nil. So other than what you imparted them in their training, which is why that's so important, because they're going to carry it with them always, you require to be able to communicate with that employee, hopefully two-way, to really provide assistance to them in time of need, either being proactive, informing them how to avoid a problem. Again, you need to communicate with them. Or if something does happen, communicating with them to figure out whether they are in harm's way or have been injured, or are not accessible, which will raise up the bar for you to focus and try to figure out what happened to them. So communication is really key. And of course, when you are doing communications, especially around an incident, getting to people quickly is very important. And we'll talk a little bit about the time continuum in a minute. When we're out there trying to communicate, you cannot rely on one modality to be able to communicate with your employees. In many situations, especially mass situations, voice networks and things go down. And even though SMSs can be slow, they will usually eventually make it through to the end device because they're queued and stored and forwarded through the network, and they work on a different channel than the voice. So again, being able to spit out SMS messages, you're more likely to be able to communicate with your employees and personnel in a mass incident than in other capabilities. So again, from the tips perspective, one is to have a communication plan. The key is who is going to communicate out this information. And it can't be one person, because when they're sick or on vacation or otherwise not available, like sleeping, who is going to communicate out to the people? So having a plan that when we have information, we know how to get it out to our personnel is key. I'm stressing this again, one number to call, because if you can drill into the employees 911 or whatever your number is, then it's going to work. If they have to have 2 or 3 or 4 different numbers for different issues, then it breaks down. And there's nothing more frustrating than to be overseas trying to do an international call, finally getting through to somebody and them telling you that that's not what they are responsible for and you need to call this other number, right? Especially when time is of the essence. And then the more details that you have about your personnel, so their mobile number, their office number, their home number, emergency contact number, if they're staying on trip, what the hotel, the more contact points that you have, because when you have somebody that doesn't respond to your outreach, now you're like, well, what's happened? Are they dead? Are they injured? Are they being held captive? And so you're going to be very quickly trying to figure out how to start calling around and trying to figure out what is the status and disposition of that individual. And you will relish every number that you have at that time. So we're going to move to another poll question. It's a long one, but it's pretty straightforward. So when you think about communications and you think about, for example, let's say somebody said there's a credible bomb threat to your manufacturing facility in city Y, and we need to communicate out to all the employees that are at that facility as well as anybody that might be traveling there, lickety-split. How confident are you that you could actually do that, right? I'm confident. I'm pretty sure that somebody can do it, or I'm nervous. I don't think I know. And that could be a bomb threat, that could be a hurricane, a big civil unrest protest that's going to go down in front of your facility tomorrow morning, whatever it may be that you need to communicate. Are you absolutely confident that you have a plan and a program and tools to do that? Pretty sure that somebody does. If it's not me, or nervous, I'm not sure that that's going to happen. Let's see how you feel about your organization being able to communicate to your employees, especially in a time of crisis. So here we go. Good. Quite a few people are very confident about what their organization has as a plan and tools, and hopefully that confidence is built on the fact that they actually test it. And so you get these test emails and SMS messages, on a hopefully quarterly basis, but at least annual, to validate the system. That would be good measure of confidence. Good number of people, again, or more than double, are pretty sure that this company has that capability. But yet we still have a substantial number of individuals out there that are very nervous and question whether their company actually could get the information out to the employees and your personnel. And those are in that order, that you would really want to step this up with your company and have a conversation around that. So let's now move to talking about a more mature program, and I don't want to overwhelm anyone, and hopefully this will be logically clear. But when we talk about a people risk management program and help organizations put it together and mature it, we focus on 10 key process areas to make that happen. And the reason we do that, all of these contribute to optimizing this very specific kind of mathematical fact. And that is, when something happens, the longer it takes you to deal with it and solve it, you are increasing, in an increasing way, for every hour, the cost both in loss of, facilities, people's lives, and ultimately cost as this thing drags on. And there's even, analysis that's been done and looking at companies that have failed to respond to major issues that have actually put the company out of business, and things escalate. So we talk about incidents being those things that you can manage with your own resources, right? So somebody is smoking in the hallway of your facility, and they're not supposed to be smoking in the facility. They hear somebody coming, and they flick it into a trash can and walk away, right? And that starts to catch on fire, smoke. The smoke detectors go off. I'm sorry, somebody walks by, sees the smoke, and puts it out. That's an incident. If the smoke triggers the fire alarm and calls the fire department, you now have an emergency, because now your resources are coming to your aid beyond your capability, right? Ambulance, fire, whatever, police. That's an emergency. And if that manufacturing facility has its doors chained lock on the emergency exits and starts on fire and engulfs in smoke like we had out in Oakland, and people now can't get out of the building or are lost in the building and die, now the company has a crisis, right? And so that's how that all escalates very quickly. And so what we want to do is we want to have a program that you nip these things early, so that, and slightly ahead, we call that early warning, where we don't even have the incident. That's where you want to respond in an optimal way. That's where you want to operate. And in order to do that, you have to invest in preparedness. And this is one of the hardest kind of sell jobs for people to get companies to spend in preparedness to try to avoid having to spend a lot of money down the road when it's really unpredictable what that spend would look like. And so there's professionals in your organization that understand this and probably fight this battle all the time. But this is the model. And so when we look at this model, we say, okay, well, how do I break that down into a program? And so at a high level, we break it down into these kind of 4 basic modules, which is your planning, which I talked about, your plans and procedures, your training, that is making people aware of those policies and procedures, both the people that you're protecting as well as the people that have to do the work of managing the program and the incident. And then having the monitoring capability so that you can understand how to avoid issues with early warning, or how to provide information to employees when there has been an incident, dealing with the incident, actually responding to it, and then getting that feedback of what went well and what didn't, and then updating your plans, procedures, training, or monitoring to help avoid that happening in the future. Pretty straightforward, but those are the main building blocks. When you break those down into who owns all this stuff is when it becomes more complicated, because human resources, while they have an important role around all the people in your company. They can't do it alone. And depending on the size of the company, you may or may not have all of these functional capabilities to partner with. But putting together a risk council or risk working group to help look at these issues around travel and people and facilities is a great start of starting to pull that together. Other things, other titles could be business continuity, health, safety, environment, medical health director. Even the business units that are operating in higher risk locations can be good advocates and good partners for you in this. So before we kind of go into the final details, I wanted to just do one more poll question. When you think about this people risk management program for your organization, who do you think really owns this? Do you feel like you do within the human resources function within your organization? Do you think security and business continuity take the lead on this? Is it corporate travel? Or are you letting the business units kind of do their own thing and they can figure out how important this is to the companies? So let's see what people are saying. Great, very interesting spread. It's, I would say, for our clients, very much security, business continuity, and sometimes risk, if they have a broader role within the organization, tend to be the champions and really push because they're the ones that can get budget. HR, and the reason that we're here today with you is because we are seeing more and more in the programs as companies are realizing that this is an issue for all personnel, not just travelers and expats or foreign nationals operating in certain countries, but this is a global all personnel issue. We are seeing more of the HR teams stepping up and taking on this as part of their remit. So interesting feedback. So last two slides to just kind of put a bookend on this relative to the more mature program. So these are all of the key process areas when we go in and work with clients that makes a full program operate. So any one of these not operating, you don't have a program that's going to work for you. We've talked a lot about the overarching KPAs, so having policies and procedures and processes to keep those updated. Likewise, the whole education and training, not only in delivery, but how do you account for that and how do you keep that updated over time are all part of the key processes. The red bread that we call it, the two pieces of the bread, the infrastructure. So how do you notify and actually push out information both internally to management as well as to your potentially impacted personnel? So how do you do that? And that's one slice. All of the data that you have to keep that we talked about, the contact information and cell phones and passports and all that kind of stuff. And then communication is program communication. How do I keep this alive and in front of my staff and my employees so that they remember that it's 911 and that they understand that the program's here and go through a communication, ongoing communication to maintain awareness around this, just like you would a health and safety program. The sandwich meat in the middle is the risk management process, right? So it's taking it from understanding the risk assessment, disclosing the output of that assessment to the impacted parties, which can be your employee, especially in the case of being on travel or having an assignment as an expat, that you need to disclose that to them. What are you going to invest in mitigation to reduce their risk, their exposure to that? How are we going to monitor it so we understand if that threat or hazard environment changes, because then I need to go through this again. And then if I do need to respond to an incident, how am I going to do that? So those are the 10 KPAs that all need to be present and operating on a continual basis to have a robust, mature program, in this case to protect all of your personnel. And then we walk through that in a series of kind of 5 levels of program maturity. So when we go in and benchmark a client or anybody that's implemented a program, we can go through, we evaluate each of the KPAs and score those, and then whatever the lowest rated KPA is what your maturity is. Because even if I have 4 KPAs at 5, if I have 1 at 2, then that's the weakest link in your program, and that needs to get resolved first to move up to the next level of maturity. And these levels are pretty straightforward. 1 basically says seat of the pants. We just deal with stuff as it comes and hope for the best. 2 is the classic. We have a bunch of stuff that consultants came in and wrote a bunch of stuff, and it's on the shelf, but we've never really use it. So it's defined but not really locked into the processes, the day-to-day processes. 3 is kind of the minimal acceptable, which says, yes, we're doing this on a consistent basis, on an ongoing, day-to-day basis. 4 says I'm actually getting the cross-organizational support for this program, in this case beyond HR. We're collecting metrics and we're kind of reviewing the program. And then level 5 are those companies that really embrace, Six Sigma, Lean, where they're really looking at how do I optimize this over time. And so that's how we look at program maturity and be able to go in and benchmark across each of those KPAs, you and your organization against other like organizations by size, footprint, number of employees, number of travelers, whatever it is that the area that we're focusing on. So hopefully that helps give you a little bit of insight into what this would look like down the road. So with that, there's always kind of implementation challenges. There's also PowerPoint challenges, agreements. But the key things that always come up as you're working through this is, management buy-in to support the program, the whole privacy issues around tracking and personal identifiable information. What is the culture of the company about how much do they care about duty of care for their employees? Some companies are very intense and others are more lackadaisical. Then getting the agreements in place for all the elements of this around your suppliers and insurance, and getting people to put policy and ink that because that becomes a liability in itself if you don't follow the policy. And then how do you measure the outcomes as far as how do you get rapid decision making, how do you ensure that the communications are working and that people understand what's going on, and of course the metrics and accountability around the program to prove that the spend is worthwhile. So these are kind of the key elements that we run into for organizations trying to implement this kind of a program. So the last question here, is this something that you're thinking about as far as broadening your program to all personnel or even implementing a people risk management program? If you already have a program, then I would just say no. You have everything you need. But if you feel like you're only firing off of a few cylinders, and if you're going to step up what you're doing around your personnel, then yes. So a little more than half of participants here saying, yeah, we're going to step up our game a little bit in 2017. So that's awesome. So I hope it's a lot of material, but I'm hoping that you have taken enough here away to help you kind of anchor where you would go. We're obviously open for questions here for the next 10 minutes or so till the hour to get any questions that come in. Be happy to respond to them as best I can and give you some insight into what we do with putting these kinds of programs together.
SHRM thanks iJet for sponsoring this program and SHRM's series of free webcasts. iJet International delivers intelligence-driven, integrated risk management solutions that enable multinational organizations to operate globally with confidence. iJet's end-to-end tailored solutions integrate world-class threat intelligence, innovative technology, and security response services to help organizations avoid threats and mitigate risk. To learn more about how iJet can help your organization prepare for, monitor, and respond to potential threats to your people, facilities, suppliers, and information. Visit ijet.com, ijet.com, or email info@ijet.com. Okay, let's turn to the questions that we have been getting from our audience. A couple folks asking just for clarification, when you're using the acronym KPA, what does that refer to?
Okay, it's a key process area. So these are just like KPIs when you're doing metrics, right? Key performance indicators. The key process areas are, where do you need institutional repeatable processes to be successful? So when you think about policies and procedures, it's not just about creating that particular version of the policy, but what is your process for actually reviewing and updating that policy over time? That's what makes you successful. It's not a one-shot project. It's an ongoing program to maintain your policies. For example, you run an exercise, you learn something, and you want to change your policy. That's all part of that process. So key process area.
Another audience member asked, I don't believe we have any safety plan. What would be a good starting point?
The good starting point from a practitioner's perspective is, what is the most likely hazard to create the most impact to either an individual or the organization? So high likelihood, high consequence is typically how you would triage where to start. Then you would work down from typically high likelihood to medium likelihood, high impact, medium likelihood, medium impact, and work your way down. Low probability, high impact. You want to make sure that you check that off, right? It's like, maybe a meteor is not going to strike the Earth with high likelihood, but boy, it would sure be a big impact. At that point, your team might just throw up their hands and say, well, everybody's going to be annihilated at that point, so we're not going to work on that one. But let's say, a Category 5 hurricane, blah, blah, blah. So high likelihood, high impact are the first things that you want to try and figure out first.
Another audience member asks, how does privacy affect the type of procedures you might implement overseas as opposed to in the United States?
It is incredibly important. It is incredibly complex, and it is incredibly dynamic. And so privacy is a moving target, and it ranges from largely don't care in certain countries to down to the work council, in Germany or France or wherever, where it is imperative, and they're intensely concerned about individual privacy and what data is retained on that individual, and more importantly, as in our system, the ability for an individual to opt out and have their information deleted from the system, this whole concept of right to be forgotten. So whomever you work with, whatever partner, they have to have a very robust, not only current implementation around privacy, but also understand the evolution of privacy laws. For example, the GPDR, which is a new data privacy, GDPR data privacy regulations for the EU that have to be instituted by May of 2018 is coming fast and hard. But privacy is a big challenge for global implementation. But solvable. We have hundreds of programs that have solved that challenge.
Another audience member has asked, in regards to workplace violence, what type of recommendations do you have for companies to protect employees who work outdoors, for example, landscapers, construction crews, and so forth?
Yeah, so again, there's a whole range of issues. The most fundamental concern that our clients have are what we call lone workers. So those individuals that you dispatch as individuals to go out and interface either with equipment or clients are the ones that have a great deal of exposure. And so thinking about your safety and security for your lone workers, is a very high priority. Then when you have personnel that are working out even in teams and crews, you actually are better off because you have, usually if it's 2 or more people, now you have an opportunity for there to be aid right on the work site if something was to happen to any one of those individuals, whether it was a workplace injury or whether it was an externality like someone spraying some bullets and accidentally hitting or purposefully hitting some of your individuals, you would have people there that can summon aid and provide support, so you tend to be better off. There are just things that you cannot totally mitigate, which is why we always start with the training around safety and security, and where those crews take a minute to assess where are they, what is their exposure, and what is their egress? How do they escape from where they are? Are they buttoned in some dead-end alley working on some pipes or whatever, and there's only one way out? That's not all that great. And they would be more sensitized to that and potentially ask for support, either from local law enforcement or private security, if they felt that there was a threat profile. So it really comes down to how many people, one being the highest exposure and potential for risk, and then, of course, from a team perspective, thinking about what their threats and risks will be and working through it. But obviously you can't solve for all eventualities, and there is always a finite probability that people are going to be hurt or killed, and how to manage that locally through training and teaching people, and then how the company is going to handle that from an emergency and crisis is what this program is all about.
Shifting to some questions about crisis training, and the crisis team, an audience member asks, can you recommend resources for employee training?
Okay, so I don't know, maybe that's too different. So crisis management training is actually all about communication. The crisis management team's job is to make decisions, but more importantly, to communicate in the appropriate ways to the various stakeholders, whether it's media, clients, employees, their families, the public. And so the crisis management training is really focused on that and teaching your crisis management team how to be effective at that. And we regularly see through our own lives when many companies are not very effective at communicating in times of crises. So that's one piece of training. The other is all the other kinds of training, safety and security. There are lots of tremendous resources. Companies like iJet and others that are in this business offer e-learning as well as classroom training. There's a great group that we partner with called the Center for Personal Protection and Safety, CPPS, out of Spokane, Washington, but offices in other cities that actually have training facilities and do a lot of personal safety and security training. And also have online tools and those kinds of things. But there are many out there.
Audience member asks, how often should training be offered to rank and file employees, that is, those who are not working in or traveling to high-risk areas?
So we always talk about 3 levels of training. We think it's important and useful for companies to do basic personal safety and security training, half an hour, to just instill good practices in all employees, not only as employees, but as in their personal life. It's a great thing to offer your employees, and most of our clients offer that on an annual basis, usually around a health and safety day. And people can go in and do the 30 minutes of training. They also offer, usually most companies offer an e-learning module for it as well, and just helping their employees, whether they're on the job or not, they're still a critical human capital asset. So that's one level. The second level is the next level of really more industrial strength training around your program and actions and things that you want your employees to take in the event of a fire drill, active shooter, emergency evacuation, while on travel, a whole series of things that you want to make sure that your employees understand what they should do and what should they expect from the company in these potential incidents and issues, right? That's level 2. And then level 3 is the training that you do for those teams internally that are responsible for actually managing the incident and emergency. And those would be the 3, kind of levels of training. If for the industrial strength, if you have high risk travel, then typically there's multiple levels of just kind of general training for employees, and then even more specialized training for those that are getting ready to go into high-risk environments. And of course, that would be done on demand when they're being deployed. The other training, typically the companies might offer at one time to an employee. If they want to take a refresh, that's on their own choice, but one time. And then the training for the team, some companies do it quarterly. We're lucky if we get them to do it annually, and that's what we would recommend, minimum annual.
Okay, thank you. With that question and answer, we are going to bring to a close today's webcast. Before we close, a couple of final thanks. First to our presenter, Bruce McIndoe of iJet, for the insight he provided in today's program. And our thanks to you in the audience for participating today and for choosing SHRM for HR webcasts. That concludes today's program.